This video is going to introduce the new studio lighting assemblies that ship with Modo 801. If I open my preset browser, you can see there are 11 new assemblies all relating to studio lighting. They range from a relatively simple area light to more complex light rigs such as softboxes, sweeps, reflectors, spotlights, to complete sets that are tailored to specific tasks such as lighting glassware or lighting large objects, medium-sized objects, and smaller objects. Now, the idea behind the more complete sets is that they can serve as useful starting points for users to then tailor to their own needs. So to begin, I'm going to walk you through the Softbox, which is probably one of the most useful of all the assemblies. So if you have a quick look at it in preview, you can see it's got a nice fall off to it here, which we can also customize a little bit, and that's going to add a nice bit of detail to your reflections. Now, these two brightly coloured locators here are the controls. The yellow locator is the main control for the whole assembly. Now, you're going to need a fair amount of screen real estate because there's quite a few controls. So if you're stuck on a small screen or you want to use a smaller viewport, that's still okay. If you select the locator, you'll see that there's a channel hall tool comes in, but here not everything is visible. However, in the properties tab, if you go to the user channels, you have access to all the controls here, but it's not quite as convenient as actually using the screen. So in this case, I'm just going to maximize this viewport so that I can see all the controls, and I'm going to open a separate preview window so that we can see what we're doing. Now, bear in mind that you're going to really need to keep an eye on preview or RayGL while you tweak these parameters, because not everything you do is going to be visible in OpenGL. So having a preview window open as you work with the light boxes, with the softbox, pardon me, is a good idea. So let me talk you through these controls. Let me just make sure that my viewport parameters are how I want them. So let's just make everything visible as advanced OpenGL. So if I click on this Use Target button here, the softbox is going to point to this blue locator, which is basically the light target, and you can move that around. So if you want your softbox to always point at a specific object or point in the scene, this is very useful, and you can enable and disable it as you like. So if you have it disabled, there's separate rotation controls. The next control you're going to want to look at is this orange locator here at the base. If you need to move the softbox, I recommend that you use this. So by clicking on it, it will automatically activate the move tool, and you can just move your softbox around the scene. And obviously, if it's got Use Target activated, then as you do this, it will always stay pointing at the blue locator. The next control you have is this visible base. You can see that the softbox is mounted on this sort of tripod. Now, it's a nice detail to have in your reflections if you want, but you might find it gets in the way or it's distracting, so you can simply hide it. The next option below that is visible to camera, and this is particularly useful if your camera is sort of behind one of these softboxes and you find it's getting in the frame. You can simply just hide it from the camera, but it will still be visible in reflections and so on. Next, we can control the intensity of the light. So it ranges from 0.1, which is very, very faint, to about 100. And obviously, if you increase the size of the softbox, this will also increase the brightness. But so 100 should be plenty bright for even extremely large scenes. The next control below that is a control to add some more softness to the light. You can see there's a fall off being added here to the shape of the light inside the softbox. Well, it's not really inside the softbox. It's actually a luminous polygon here, but you get the idea. Below that, we can alter the color temperature of the light coming out. Just make it warm or cool. So this is useful for adding a tiny little bit of color to the softbox. Below that, we have a very useful control, which is basically a vertical slit. So for example, if you want to make a really nice tall thin reflection in a wine bottle, for example, this is the control you'd use for that. And if you need it to be the other way, well, you can simply rotate your softbox in the Z direction to alter the direction of the slit. So I'll just put the slit back to its default value. And next we have a grid control. Now what this does is this cycles through 4 different grids. So you've got some simple horizontal lines, which you can also obviously rotate if you rotate the softbox. Then you've got a sort of triangular, then you've got a triangular pattern, followed by a simple grid of squares and some octagonal cells. Now below that you can control the size of the grid, so you can make it extremely large or extremely fine, depending on what effect you're looking for. You can also control the line width, so you can make the lines thicker or thinner as you wish. And I've put the grid back to its default value of off. Then you can control the width of the softbox and its height independently. You can control how high it is on the stand, so it goes to from 200 millimeters all the way up to 2 meters, so that's quite useful real world kind of range. And finally you can rotate it in all 3 axes. Now if I drop those controls, there's also some instructions. Let me just close the preview window. You can toggle help on and off, and that will just bring up some text in the viewport, and there's also a tips panel for you. And if I return to my preset browser, I can now load up the octagonal softbox, which is very similar, except it's got a different shape obviously, and slightly simplified controls in that it doesn't have independent width and height. Basically everything is controlled by a single size parameter. Otherwise everything is the same, but obviously this gives you more circular type reflections, which can be useful in certain circumstances. The next assembly I'm going to look at is the area light softbox. Now this also is fairly similar to the regular softbox, but it uses a light instead of a luminous polygon. So this means that it might be faster to calculate in certain circumstances, but on the other hand it has fewer controls because you can do a lot more with a mesh based assembly than you can do with a light based one. But there are times when having an area light instead of a luminous polygon is definitely very useful, which is why I've included it. So you can change the shape of it to a circle. It also has a use target command, just like the regular softbox does. You can make it visible to camera. You can also make it visible to reflections, which the other assembly doesn't have, because obviously the mesh-based one, its whole purpose is to be visible to reflections, so I can't imagine a situation where you would not want it visible to reflections. But with a light-based one, you might decide to use specular shading instead. I think reflection-based shading will be much more realistic, but there are definitely cases where you might want to use specular instead. But specular is off by default with this, but you can turn it back on by unticking this control. You've also got a simple shading control. Now in most cases you won't need this, especially if you're using reflections instead of specular, but if you were to use the specular by unticking this and maybe unticking this, you might want to consider having simple shading off. It's on by default, but you might want to consider having it off just to give your specular highlights a little more realism. So just as with the mesh-based softbox assembly, you can control the intensity of the light. You can also control the softness, but it won't be quite as versatile as using the mesh-based assembly, simply because with a light item you won't have the same kind of control. You control the number of samples. It defaults to 64, but you can go all the way up to 4096. And if you find that you don't have fine control here with when the range is so high, you can just enter the value directly here like so. You also have warm or cool controls, just like you do with the mesh-based assembly. It won't be quite as visually pleasing again with a light item, but it's still useful. And again, you can control the width and the height of the softbox independently, the Y position and the rotation in all 3 axes. Next, I'm going to show you how the spotlight assembly works. So this has got an extra locator, just because I didn't want this menu to get really tall. So I've separated the visibility options from the actual controls. So I'll just open preview again. So let's just rotate this light slightly so that we can see it a little better. There we go. So let's look at the visibility options to start with. You can toggle the lens on and off, so that puts a glass lens in front of the light. You may or may not want it to be visible in your reflections. There's also a diffuser, which isn't actually going to diffuse the light, it just changes the way the light reflects, so you can see that it basically makes the lens translucent rather than transparent. Again, you can make the stand invisible in both preview and GL if it gets in the way. You can hide the whole thing from the camera. You can also hide it from global illumination and reflections. And as before with the area light type assembly, you can turn specular on and off. Now again, I think the whole purpose of an assembly like this is for it to be visible to reflections. You can control specularity and reflection independently from each other. So there are cases where you may want to have both. But generally I would keep it hidden. Finally, you can decide whether you want this to cast shadows, and again, if you're using speculars, you may want to turn simple shading off. It's up to you. And now we can have a look at the actual controls. So just as before, you have the use target option, which will make sure that the light is always pointing at the target. I've made sure to make the targets different colors and locator shapes, and the same with the bases, so that if you have multiple elements in your scene, multiple assemblies in your scene, at least all the spotlights will be different to the softboxes and so on, so that it gets a little bit less confusing, because obviously if you're using multiple assemblies you could end up with quite a few locators cluttering your scene. So just bear in mind that the spotlights have these purple bases and these blue sort of pyramid locators. And just as with the other light assemblies, you can control the strength of the spotlight. So again, it's going from 0.1 to 100. I've tried to keep it vaguely real world. You might find in some very large sets that 100 isn't quite enough, but then you simply just add another light, just like you would in the real world. Next, you can control the bulb radius, which basically will control the softness of your shadows. So obviously the larger the bulb is, the softer your shadows will be. Now this isn't entirely realistic, because you can actually make this bulb sort of 1/2 meter in radius, which will give you extremely soft shadows, but it would obviously never fit inside an assembly of this size. Just be careful when increasing the bulb radius that you don't go too high, because you could basically add a lot of noise to your images if you're not careful. You've got the samples control underneath here in case you are getting noisy shadows, so you can always increase the number of samples in the light, and we'll go all the way up to 4096 if you really need that many. But if you keep a lowish radius, then you shouldn't need too many samples. You can also control the size of the spotlight. Now this is going to basically scale the entire assembly, make it bigger and smaller, just like it does with the softbox type assemblies. So if you want your reflection, for instance, to be a lot bigger, simply make the light bigger. This will also scale the spotlight item that's inside here, because this isn't using global illumination for the lighting. Is basically there's a luminous item in here for your reflections, but the actual lighting is coming from a spotlight, a light type. So I'm just going to make this plane here visible, and let's use target so I can talk about the next features that I want to walk you through. So if you make the spotlight bigger, just be aware that it's going to bring it closer to your subject, so it's actually going to make the cone smaller. But all you can do is simply move it further away to counteract this. Now, as we have a spotlight light item inside this assembly, we can control the size of the cone, just like we can with any kind of spotlight. The softness of the cone as well, which is pretty useful. So let me just make the cone a little wider, and let's bring the spotlight back up a little bit, because I want to show you the barn doors. These are a pretty cool feature. If I enable them, you can see that basically it creates a set of barn doors around the spotlight assembly, and you can open these up just like you can with real barn doors. But A nice feature that I've added is that if you bring the barn door angle down to 0, you can see that there's still a little bit of room to the left, and this means that you can actually turn your barn doors into a snoot, and this is creating a very focused beam on the floor, which is a nice little thing if you want to shine a very bright light on a very specific part of a set. It's very useful. Let me just disable these. And once again, you can control the height of your spotlight on its stand, and you can rotate it in the X and the Y. There's no point in rotating this in the Z because it's a circular object, so you wouldn't actually see any difference. And finally, you can control the color of the light, and this will also have some effect on the bulb, so this will affect your reflections as well. So you've got RGB controls, so you can essentially create any color that you like using these 3 sliders. The next assembly that I want to show you is the reflector. So this is basically not a luminous object. This would just serve as a reflection card. Let me just open preview so you can see. So the basic shape of it is a white square, but you can control quite a few parameters. The first thing you can change is the reflector color. You can cycle through 4 options. You've got white, then you've got black. Finally, you've got silver, which is like a blurry silver, like a blurry chrome, and finally you have gold, which is a blurry gold, like the kind of photographic reflectors you often see. You can bend the entire thing, so if you want it to wrap around an object, that can be pretty useful. You can do some quite extreme bends, but these might be necessary if you scale your object so it's very, very large. I'm just going to close preview to speed things up a little bit. Now you've got some visibility options, just like you do with the other assemblies. You can decide whether you want this to cast shadows or not, whether you want it visible to camera, visible to indirect rays, visible to reflections. You can also control the height and the width independently, so you can see if it's very wide that you might need the bend to be more extreme. You've also got the use target option, but I thought actually with a reflector type there's another option that you might want, is rather than pointing down at a target, you might just want it to face the target. So let me just demonstrate how this works. I'm just going to drop this tool, select the target, let's move it so it's slightly off axis, and go back to my reflector controls. So you can see if I use target, it will point to the target in all 3 directions, but instead if I ask it to face the target, you can see it's not gonna point down. It's always going to be perfectly straight in the vertical axis, but it will still face your target, which is pretty useful. So this toggle works whether you've got use target on or off. And finally, you can rotate it just like the others in the X, Y, and Z. And the final control you have is whether you want your reflector to be double-sided. I think in most cases single-sided is the most useful, but I just thought the option should be there in case you need it. The last of these simple assemblies is this sweep, so I'll just load that into the viewport. It's got this locator around it in case you want to scale, rotate or move it, so you can basically scale it in any axis you like to fit the size of your scene. It can go as large as you need, so there's really no restrictions here at all. And it's designed so that basically your subject matter would be at world center. So for example, if I just switch to the layout tab and double click on this preset, you can see that it's loaded it bang in the middle of the sweep. It's essentially ready to shoot, so that's quite useful. And you have some extra controls here. Let me just quickly open a preview window and let's zoom in here so that you can see how to control the sweep and what the parameters do. So first of all, you can control the amount of bend, so you can make it flat if you need to, or you can make it very bendy indeed. And the nice thing about making it very bendy is that that will actually have quite a profound effect on the background of your scene. So you can really control the lighting, especially if you shine a spotlight somewhere behind there. You can also cycle between light and dark. So by default it's white, but you can make it grey or black or anything in between. You can add a certain amount of reflection, so you can make it glossy. And you can also blur the reflection if that's what you want. You can control the number of reflection samples. It defaults to 64, but it goes all the way up to 4K if that's what you need. And if you're using blurry reflections, you can also add some clear coat to add a layer of sharp reflection on top of your blurry reflection. And finally, you can make the sweep translucent, which is pretty useful if you shine a light sort of behind it or from underneath. Having a bit of translucency will create a pool of light, which is a really nice way of highlighting your subject matter. So to demonstrate the functionality of these assemblies, I've just quickly loaded an asset from the standard content, and I'm going to quickly build a set around it. So let's start with a sweep, and just to get us going, let's get a softbox in there as well. So first thing I'm going to need to do is just make the sweep a little larger, I think. So let's click on the locator and stretch it out this way, and let's make it a bit taller as well. Now let me locate my camera, so make sure cameras are visible. All cameras, there it is. And I think I'm going to want to rotate this camera around, so let's just quickly put it into position like this. And next I'm going to move this softbox. Let's just place it, I'm still relatively close. Let's put the target on our object, and then let's point softbox at the target and quickly just bring it down roughly to ground level. So this should be a reasonable starting point. Let's open preview and see what we've got. And indeed, you can see we've got some basic lighting in place. So I think what I need to do is to add at least one more softbox and possibly a spotlight. So I'll quickly just pause preview so it doesn't slow me down too much while I load the next softbox. So I'll just load that into my scene. Now because I've scaled the sweep up in the Y, it's covering my locator, but that's not a problem. Let's just go into wireframe mode, and now I can access my locator. Let's bring this to one side. Let's also place the target near the geometry. Now it's running a little bit slowly because I've got the screen capture software running at the same time, but they shouldn't be this slow when you're running in a normal scene. It's literally because I'm recording the video at the same time. So let's bring it down in the Y position, and let's unpause preview and see what we've got. So you can see it's starting to shape up quite nicely, pretty quickly in fact. Now the next thing I'm going to do is just to add a little bit of light to the background. So once again I'm going to pause preview, and I'm going to open my preset browser, load a spotlight in, and once again let's quickly go into wireframe so I can select everything and get the target, and I'm just going to place it roughly behind the asset that I'm photographing, and make sure I get the right locator. Let's move the spotlight around, go back to GL view and use target. Now if I unpause preview, we can see what we're doing. Okay, so that's a little bit too strong for what I want. No problem, let's just reduce it. And it's nice to have a little bit of fall off there. So in fact I might decide, let's select that target again just to exaggerate that slightly, or have it go the other way. Yeah, that's quite nice. So now the final thing I'd like to do is just to maybe add a highlight here. So I'll pause preview once again and open my preset browser, load another spotlight, and just as before, let's just quickly pop into wireframe mode, select this locator, make sure it's the right one, yeah, and once again I'm going to place my target on the asset, and now enable use target. Now the next thing I need to do is to play with the light so that I can place a reflection, so I can see the reflection there. I probably need to bring this down a touch, there we go, and I can do a couple of things. I can increase the size of the actual light, so making it smaller will create a smaller reflection, obviously. It doesn't actually affect the quality of the lighting, it really is just the reflection that it's going to affect, though obviously making the light bigger does increase the luminosity, just because the surface area of the luminous geometry is bigger. So let's just make it a little smaller. Something like that. Now if you find, it's okay on this kind of surface, but if you find this lensing pattern distracting, then one thing you can do is, if you go back to the visibility, you can click on the diffuser, and that will create a more solid kind of highlight, as you can see there. So it's nothing too fancy. I'd probably want to make the shadow a lot softer, so by increasing the bulb radius, or you can get rid of the shadow altogether if that's what you prefer, but I'll keep the shadow, just make it really soft. You can see that in very little time I've created some lighting. I mean, it's a pretty basic asset, but you can see created a studio type shot very quickly, and the quality of the reflections is really nice because we've got a little bit of extra realism in the softboxes, so you can see the fall off, for instance, on the edge here. It's not just white cards, and I think those little details really add quite a lot of believability to your renders. So now let me talk you quickly through the purpose-built sets that I've created. So the first one is this Glassware Studio High Key. And the idea here is that I've obviously already placed some lights and some black reflectors and a sweep. The wine glass is also part of the assembly, but it's highlighted in red in the item list, so you can easily find it if you need to delete it or simply hide it. And the idea of this particular assembly is that it's set up so that you get some really nice reflections and refractions in your glassware. Now the black reflectors are placed purposely to refract in the edges of the wine glass, because otherwise you actually wouldn't be able to see the edges of the wine glass, because in order for transparency to really pop against a paint background like this, you're going to need some kind of refraction in the edges. So I've set this up for you, but it's just a starting point, and you can easily move the reflectors and the lights to suit your own purposes. So let me just close this scene and load the next assembly, which is basically the same thing but in reverse. So this time it is slightly different setup because we don't need the black reflectors. We're using a kind of dark studio environment, so I've placed this sort of large box around the set, and then there's just a couple of lights basically to create refractions and reflections. And you can see it's the same idea. We've got a very bright refraction on the edges of the glass, so that the glass is well defined against the background. And again, you can alter all of this to suit your own needs. So the next set I'd like to show you is the light tent. So this is based on the idea of a real light tent. It's a translucent box with one hole at one end for the camera, and then 3 lights shining through, and it's essentially the subsurface scattering which is transmitting the light through the fabric to give a very soft diffuse lighting on your subject matter. Now there's one important detail about this. You can see it looks quite dull here. It's because Modo's default parameters only have 1 bounce of global illumination. Now you can increase the intensity of the lights to get a brighter setting, but that's not going to give you the realism that really this is designed to provide. So what I would recommend is to increase the GI bounces. You see, if I increase this to 4 and put this into extended refinement so we can really see what the 4 bounces are doing. Probably have to restart preview. Now you can see we've got a much brighter, more diffused effect, which is much closer to what a real light tent would do. So again, this is just a starting point, and it's not something that you should just use like that. Feel free to move the lights around and to experiment with it. So the next set I'd like to look at is the Tabletop Studio, so I'm just going to double click on that to load it in GL. Now because I've got a black constant regulating the sort of lightness and darkness of this sweep, it comes in completely black in GL, which is a bit unfortunate, but you can easily get around this by switching to Gooch or to reflection mode, so now you can see a little bit more clearly what's going on. Now when you load these sets, be sure to turn off your default lighting in modo, because otherwise it's going to mess everything up. I'll show you what I mean. This is what the lighting looks like, but if you forget to turn off your directional light, it'll look like this, and you'll think it's not that nice. But obviously once you turn off all the other lights in the scene, this is what it looks like. Now I'll show you how it's set up. It's basically a large softbox and this spotlight here, and I've given the sweep some transparency, and I've placed a spotlight underneath it, and that's giving us this nice little sort of halo around the object. Now again, this is just meant to be as a starting point. You're really supposed to play around and move the lights and add or remove lights to suit your subject, but it's a very quick way of getting started. And finally we have the large studio set, so I'm just going to load this in GL and turn off my default lighting. So this comes in with the car in position, but obviously the idea is that you turn it off and replace it with your own geometry. Now this is probably the most open-ended of all the sets, but again it's just a useful starting point. You've got a sweep in place, you've got some spotlights illuminating the background, but you can move them around and really tailor it to suit whatever you want. But as you can see, it's a pretty useful starting point if you've got a large item that you want to render, and you've got a lot of freedom here to basically use it as a basis of anything that you can imagine.